Hello. Today we are going to talk about not the collapse of Rome, but feudalism. What came out of the collapse of Rome?
That was very strange, I know, but I had to make a point. So, with the collapse of Rome, right? Imagine the United States government just disappeared out of the blue. The most powerful government in the world just completely disappeared, and everyone is left without someone to lean on, someone to organize them, someone to give them laws, someone to give them protection, right? Without that big sense of security, who are you going to look to? You are going to look to the people near you that can protect you the most. The person in your neighborhood that you can see that can obviously protect you, right? So the world becomes more local after the collapse of Rome. And what ends up happening is this system called the feudal system. Not very complicated to explain, but I will explain it to you quickly today. One thing before we start. When Rome collapsed, Rome had money, right? Like actual money that you could give in exchange for things. But a disorganized society can't really have money because no one would really trust it and no one would really know how to make it or where to get it or what to use for it, right? So during the feudal times, instead of money, people traded things instead of using money in exchange for things. So instead of going to the store and saying like, oh, I want this bag of Takis, right, for X amount of dollars, you would say, I want this bag of Takis for X amount of hours that I would work in your field, right? Different time, different way of paying for things, but the same premise, right? Okay, let's talk about feudalism. Rome is gone. Protection from the whole gigantic government is gone. You look to a local person to protect you. Who are you going to look to protect you? The most powerful person in your neighborhood, the person that is the richest, the person that is the strongest, the person that owns the most stuff. That person is the person that became the king. So let's take a look at kings. Right? That person became the king. The king owned the entire neighborhood. Let's imagine that this very goofy triangle is the neighborhood, right? But they own it. But the king can't rule this gigantic place by himself, because imagine that a king rules a kingdom, right? That's not hard to imagine. But kingdoms are large, and kingdoms are so large, in fact, that they need assistance to be run. Just like a country needs assistance to be run. Just like a state like New Jersey has a governor to help the president run the whole country, the king needs helpers to rule different parts of their kingdom to make things easier. And it's even harder for them back then because they don't have instantaneous communication, right? They can't use cell phone to say to someone 500 miles away, hey, can you get a hold of this riot going on in your part of the country? Because it just doesn't exist. Communication travels at the speed of people. So they need people to rule in smaller areas for them, right? So the king gives parts of his kingdom away to his most trusted people. We'll call them lords. But the king would call them vassals because vassal means servant, right? It means someone that serves the king, right? And in exchange for this fief, right? The fief is the fancy word for land. The fief is the fancy word for land that the king gives to the lords. In exchange for that, the lords agreed to give loyalty and military aid to the king, right? But do these lords want to fight themselves? In the earliest days, yes, they did. because back then people were tougher. But throughout most of the Middle Ages, that was not the case. And they had to find people who lived in their neighborhood who were good fighters. So, what did they do with them? They put them in this feudalism triangle, right? And those people became knights, right? We see them here in this orange part of the triangle. Knights are who we think they are. They're people that wore fancy armor. They're people that rode horses. They're people that were in the military. And what ended up happening is these people who got a slice of the country from the king ended up giving a small slice of their country to the knight, right? So this person would give some to the knights, this person would give some to the knights, this person would give some to the knights, to the knights, to the knights. And in exchange for that smaller piece of land, the knights would agree to give loyalty or homage to the lords and also military service, right? But these knights were never home. So what are they going to do with the land? They can't just have the land sitting around. It's going to get weeds on it, right? If you have a lawn like mine where you're too busy taking care of your kid to go out on your lawn every day and take care of it, you're going to get weeds in it. And that's really bad for when you're growing vegetables and fruit. So the knights needed someone to work their land. And what happened? Peasants, the people who were left that weren't fighting, but were still living there, they become part of this feudal triangle, right? Peasants. They're the lowest class in society, and they work on the lands for the knights, they work on the lands for the lords, and they work on the lands that actually belong to the king too, right? These people live everywhere, but whichever piece of land they live on, the exchange is the same. The peasants farm the land and pay rent, and in exchange they get food, which they actually technically grow, but they're allowed to keep, and shelter. They're allowed to live on the land, right? Now, when we talk about pay rent, the rent that we're talking about is not usually in money. The rent that we're talking about is usually in vegetables or fruit or grains, right? They would farm X amount, let's say 10 amounts of wheat. And let's say 2 amounts of those wheat go to the Lord or whoever owns their land, and 8 amounts of those wheat go to the peasants that they're able to keep, which they can eat, save, sell, do whatever they want with, right? That's how the exchange would work. So, to make a long story short, the king was the strongest person in the neighborhood and the richest person in the neighborhood, who basically owned the neighborhood, a very large neighborhood. The king's friends got pieces of the neighborhood in exchange for loyalty and the promise of military aid. But because they weren't fighting themselves, they had to find people to fight for them. So they found the knights, right? And the knights agreed to provide that military aid in exchange for land and the ability to live there and food, right? And the knights, they couldn't farm this food themselves, so the peasants provided the worker for the knights and for the lords and for the king. They're the ones that provided the farm hand, the farm working, right? They're the ones that farmed the land. They're the ones that paid the rent on the land. So whoever had these peasants would get food from them and rent from them, but the peasants would also get to keep the food and get to live there. So, long story short, it's a this for that exchange. The king owned everything, gave some of it to his friends, who gave some of it to his soldiers, who gave some of it to his peasants, and everyone got something back in return. That is feudalism. And it all happened because Rome collapsed and there was no central government to hold everyone together. It's been a pleasure. Glad to have made this video for all of you, and I hope that you enjoyed it, understood it, and everything like that, right? It was a good time. Good time had by all. I'm going to go hide again. Peace.